Everybody here is going to know about Windows, but did all of you know that there's another operating system that you could use? Did you know it was free? We're going to talk about Linux. Before I begin, don't forget to like the video if you like the video, subscribe to the channel. Also, link is down below to the merch store. Go get some great merch. When it comes to operating systems, Windows runs almost entirely a monopoly here. Linux, though, is a great challenger to this, and quite honestly, it's one that not everybody knows, but it is starting to take up a little bit of popularity recently. So it is something we should talk about. There are things good for it, and there are also things that are bad about it. However, we are going to just keep everything chill, and we're going to talk about 10 good things and 10 bad things about Linux. Before I go into this, don't think I'm a Windows just sycophant. I may run Windows because it's easier for making YouTube videos and streaming for when I want to. Linux is, quite honestly, my more favorite of the two. However, I don't use it because I'm not as code savvy as I'd like. However, there are ways to get around that in Linux. Again, we'll talk about that in a second. I'm just trying to say, Linux diehards, please don't hate me. I'm going to do my best to try and make you guys happy. Just know, I can't make all of you happy. So first things first, when it comes to the 10 things that are really good about Linux, it's free. You have to pay for a Windows operating system to get all of the features. Now, you can just use the normal Windows and just have the little watermark in the corner, and you'll get basically every single functionality except for a few different things, but Linux is entirely free. I think there are a couple Linux distros that you can pay for if you want, but most of them you can get pretty free, and there's a reason for that. It's an open source software. Open source meaning that you can actually change the code and customize it, which gets into our next thing, is it is incredibly customizable. If you don't want certain aspects, you can go in and turn off certain aspects of the operating system, and they won't be running in the background or anything. While with Windows, you have to go through some effort to get rid of Cortana. And without Cortana, you lose a whole bunch of functionality with Windows. Let's just face that here. Cortana is incredibly important for Windows. A big argument from Windows is going to say that they're not as secure. It's actually entirely false. Linux is incredibly secure when it comes down to their security, and it mostly has to do with that every Linux distro is different than the next one. There's a kernel that's the same, but that's just one aspect. It's completely customizable, so you have to create a new virus for each individual Linux computer, almost. It's just not worth it in the end. So that's why everybody attacks Windows computer. It is also incredibly lightweight. In fact, you can run Linux operating systems off of a little USB drive. In other words, you can go with a computer in your pocket, and that way you are capable of just using everything at any computer that you want. It's really nice. Another aspect of this is that while Linux users there aren't many in numbers, it is a strong community, and they are very passionate. That is one of the things I love about Linux users. They are very passionate about Linux, and they want Linux to succeed. So if you have questions, you can very easily go to a Linux forum based on your distro, and they can very, very easily help you. Sometimes you might get some condescending people, but that's just how people are. Don't take that as how every Linux user is. Linux is actually also more stable. This would be 3, I think. Yeah. Linux is incredibly stable. Also means you have more performance. For instance, I can run a Linux operating system, I think off of like 8 gig of RAM at the very most. Amazing. You can't run Windows without 8 gigs, and that's to get a good experience. You can run it on less, but you start getting some problems. It takes a while to boot. Linux is incredibly lightweight and great performance. So that is the good thing. They have very consistent updates. I think this has got to be 6. I'm losing my numbers. Linux is incredibly great about updates. Some distros get 2 updates a year, some get 4, some get more. So if you want more or less updates, you can choose. And speaking of that thing of choice, there are hundreds of options for Linux. There's actually a chart that'll show you every Linux distro that has been made since Linux was first come inception. Like it came and it was awesome. I think Macs are technically based off of Linux kernel if memory serves. It has been a little bit, so don't hold me to that one. For instance, there are Linux distros for beginners. This would be like Ubuntu, Pop OS, and there's a third one. I think it's Mint. There are even ones that are a bit more for those heavy end users. And there's also ones for enterprise users. I don't know the heavy end user ones too well, just because I'm still a beginner at this. I do know the enterprise ones a little bit because my dad works in database. He had Red Hat, and I think currently they run Oracle. And honestly, most server companies or companies that have servers run Linux servers because they are just a lot better in performance and stability. And quite honestly, they don't want to deal with Windows servers because Windows servers are kind of a pain. And this might actually get a few people. Linux is incredibly easy to install. In fact, if you were to do a little speed test on how fast you can install a Linux distro and installing a Windows on a different computer with the same specs, Linux is gonna smoke Windows. This is because Linux doesn't have to go back and talk to any other company about your information. Windows is constantly going back from Microsoft to your computer, giving them your information, where you are, every little aspect that they need to configure your experience. And then when they're setting everything up, that's when you start realizing, and what were you doing when you were configuring my experience? It's a thing. Can anybody else tell that I don't like Windows installs? And the last thing is gonna be Linux is freedom. Freedom of choice. In fact, you can even create your own operating system. You can take the Linux kernel, which you can get by itself by downloading it, and you can download it and then take the kernel and write your own code and create your very own operating system. This can be as simple as you want it, as complex as you want it, and it's amazing. And the reason you can do this is because the Linux kernel allows it and is made for it. Now, we've already spent a lot of time talking about why Linux is amazing. Please don't hate me, this is why Linux is not as amazing. To begin with, you don't get a lot of the softwares that you like. To my knowledge, you don't get Microsoft Office, but that's for an obvious reason. You don't get Adobe, so if you're a content creator and you use Adobe, you can't use that. I don't know if I'd be able to use DaVinci though. Ooh, that'd be a problem for me. I need that. 7-zip is not on there, but they have their own form of it. In fact, for all of these, Linux has their own version, or a version that is supported by Linux. I will have to look now if DaVinci is supported. I do know OBS is supported on it. However, sometimes the experience is not the best. I have seen a few people have problems and not understand what's going on and just had to turn off their computer and then restart it, and that fixed it. Now, that is one of the things that happens, but honestly, as long as you document the problem and send it to somebody that can fix it, it is well documented and should be fixed through another update. Be it through an update through OBS, because OBS is an incredibly open software program that is quite honestly one of my favorites, or through Linux, because Linux will make sure that their distros are going to get updated and get the correct fixes. Now, remember when I said you had a lot of choices? That's a thing. There are 600 choices, and sometimes it can get really, really complicated on which one to use, which one's better than the other, which one's easier to use, which one's more complicated. And for me, who actually understands a bit of tech and also starting to learn about code, I would use Linux as a tool, a specific distro for what I'm doing, and that makes sense to me. However, there are 600 different Linux distros. That's a lot of choices that you could make, and honestly could entirely screw up. Now, I will just give this: no operating system's perfect. Windows has its problems, Linux has its problems. Linux has a lot of bugs, and they get fixed. Don't get me wrong, they get fixed quickly, and sometimes you can fix them yourself because you have full access to the source code. That doesn't mean that there aren't problems. And some problems haven't been fixed because they're not as well documented, or because nobody has figured out the fix for them yet. That is one of the things about having an open source community. A lot of these distros aren't exactly made by a company. They're made by an individual or completely companies. For casual users, that's not really a good experience. If they have a buggy experience, they're going to leave and go back to Windows, because at least they know with Windows bugs, they'll get fixed in a relatively quick manner. Sometimes some of these don't get fixed. Support. While there is those forums I talked about for Linux, that's not the really support that some people prefer. Some people prefer expert support through like a phone or live chat, and Windows has that available. Most Linux distros don't. I don't really knock it against them, because again, not all of them have the ability to do this. Drivers. Some drivers aren't always updated. For instance, NVIDIA drivers, because NVIDIA is very careful about the drivers that they put out, and they don't really like open source products, because you can play with their coding then. NVIDIA has not released ray tracing onto Linux. My last knowledge, this hasn't happened. They have been talking about doing it, and they have put some patches in that are marking that it's coming, but not quick enough to my liking. However, AMD been really great about this, and they have done really well. Not everybody, though, does. Like I said, NVIDIA's had problems. Some Logitech or Elgato things don't have any drivers at all, and they don't have support on Linux. Now, there are people that have actually created support by creating their own program, but then you're trusting that somebody is going to give you a program that's not going to do something to your computer. It's a bit of a give and take here, and I get a little sketched out myself, and I understand that not all these companies want to do it, because there is, let's give it a very fair termination here, 90% Windows users. There's 10% Linux users. Future Steven here. So the actual reason why a lot of companies don't do a lot of updates to their software or don't have software on Linux is mainly because they don't want to put forth the time and effort. While there is a very decent amount of users for Linux, there aren't that many, and a lot of companies make the choice that if there's not that many, it's not worth trying to go into, and it's just a better budgeting way to just go with where the 90% of people are, which is in Windows, and to just not really worry too much about those on Linux. This is changing. There are a lot of people that are fixing this and on the developer side, but it is a slow going effort, and it will take time to fix this. Back to the rest of the video. For instance, Like I said, Elgato, a lot of it, I don't think any of their stuff is actually on Linux. They actually have a community that uses it and honestly just has created the software for themselves. Gaming on Linux. You can game on Linux and it can be a great experience. However, anti-cheat is a problem for Linux because anti-cheat says that Linux, because it is open source, and the programs that are most commonly used to cheat are open sourced, and this is my assumption here, I don't know the entire rabbit hole that this is, that open source programs, a lot of games will not work. For instance, Doom, I think it was a Doom Eternal, does not work because of anti-cheat. I think Fortnite doesn't work because of anti-cheat. There's a lot of games that can't work because of the anti-cheat. However, you can play GTA 5 on Linux. You can play, I don't know the entire list, but there is a list of games that work on Linux. I have to find the program again that lists these. The Witcher 3 works on it. Stellaris works on it. Natively, even. Here's a thing. World of Warships works on some. It varies. Just give me that. So again, it's kind of a disadvantage and an advantage because there are some games you can't play. There are games you can play. It all depends on the kind of gamer you are. If you're somebody that games with their friends a lot and they tend to hop from game to game, there are some games you're not going to be able to play, and that's going to hurt, especially if you're a very social creature in these games. I'm not. I like my own bit of privacy in gaming, so yeah. Linux can be complicated. I use can. I'm not saying it is entirely, because there are ways to make it simple. Like for instance, using Ubuntu, Spearmint, wow, Linux Mint, or Linux Pop OS. Those are very basic. A couple of those actually kind of run a lot like Windows, if I'm remembering correctly. Windows operating systems. But if you want to do certain things, it can get a little complicated because it requires command line usage. Now, you can ease this by going on the internet and reading through forums and on the steps on how to use command line for what you're trying to do, because there are people that have actually done this full line of testing, but not every user, and please just give this to me, not every user is that tech savvy. And that's a hard thing for me, at least personally, is that I can't say that Linux is for everybody if there are aspects of the software that a lot of people can't use that can greatly impact the ease of use of the software. That hurts it. That hurts it a lot to me. Now, this is kind of a give and also not the best thing. Another reason that kind of goes against Linux is the fact that Windows is so massive in terms of users. Again, there are 90% of the users in the world that are using Windows, 10% are using Linux. That kind of gives a stigma. Now, this is just my own personal feeling, so take it with a grain of salt. When 90% of the users in the world are using one thing, and you try to go against that, it honestly isn't amazing, because you get a feeling that you're being judged. If you mention to your friends, hey, I'm running a Linux thing, can we play a different game, things like that, it kind of drags down. And it's a thing. And also, Linux doesn't operate the same as Windows. There are distros that do operate the same or similar to Windows, but it doesn't have the same functionality in some ways, or there are other problems. It's just one of those things that you kind of have to run into, and you have to make a decision. My decision is to run Windows just because I've used it most of my life, and I've only recently started to use Linux on virtual machines. I don't know if if this is saying more about people, or if this is saying a lot about how Linux is. I think it's more about how people are. When people start to use Linux and they haven't tried it before even actually doing it and haven't looked into it, and they just download Linux, they get onto it and they get confused, they turn the computer off, delete Linux, and get back onto Windows. Because a lot of people don't have the time, don't want to spend the time to figure out what happened or what they need to do. This is more of I hit a brick wall and I don't want to figure out my way around it. I'm just going to go back the way I came kind of scenario. And it's one of those things where I'm more of like, you just could have just Googled it on your phone, because 90% of you have a smartphone. So, I don't know on that one. Do I have a recommendation on what to do if you want to try Linux? And it's very simple. Download a virtual machine. I currently run an Oracle Virtual Machine VirtualBox, so that I can do some classwork, because that's actually required for my class. But you can use this. You can use this to set up an operating system and try it out. See if you like it. See if it fits how you want it. And also to learn the command line, because that is an incredibly important part of Linux. There are ways you can do things without using the command line, but in the end, you need to learn how to use the command line. Sorry, it is very important. Also, another way is talking to people that have used Linux, getting their feedback on what they thought was good, looking through forums on common problems for certain distros, just because while people don't really want to mention that there are problems sometimes with things they like, there are problems. Let's just face this. It's a real world. Shit happens. I do hope that this helped. I do hope that none of you guys forever hate me. Because this was not an easy video for me to make, because again, I love Linux. I love its functionality, I love its performance. I'm just not that familiar with the command line enough that I feel I want to get into this as deep as I'd like to. However, I feel like I've shown that I have a decent holding on Linux as a operating system. However, I could be wrong. Leave a comment down below if you think I was wrong, or if you think that I missed something, because let's just face it, I probably did. There's a lot on Linux and Windows. There's a lot there. 600 operating systems and all of them Linux versus Microsoft and Windows. I'm sure I missed something. Thank you guys for tuning in. Don't forget to like the video if you liked the video. Subscribe to the channel. Also, link is down below to the merch store. Go get some great merch. You know, I don't really have a lot that probably fits into this category. Though, if you guys enjoyed this video, how about you guys go check out the why don't you guys go check out the video I did on if you should buy last gen product right now when we are currently on the new gen, and how much it could save you in money. Thank you guys again for tuning in, and have a good day.